how much we document now, there will always be those before we had the chance to document them. The Columbus State Hospital is one such case. The Columbus State Hospital was not as well documented as other Kirkbrides.
In 1954, inside the cold halls of Columbus State Hospital, Dr. Leonard Thorp sat with a 94-year-old patient named Edith Thorne. She didn't offer the ramblings of a fading mind, but a chilling account of 9-foot-tall, high people who shared our streets until 1915. Was Edith Thorne the last living link to a giant reality we were forced to forget? Have you ever noticed how some old buildings have doors that feel way too big for humans? If she was right, our history is a lie. But how could they scrub an entire race without leaving a trace? The Great Erasure of 1890. The answer to why you have never heard of these high people actually lies in a tragic accident that happened on January the 10th, 1921. And this single event essentially turned our collective history into a blank slate. Think about that for a second, because we are always told that history is recorded in books and archives. But what happens when the most important book of all just disappears? The 1890 federal census was a massive deal because it was the first time the government used high-tech punch cards to track the population.
In the USA, the census of 1890 led to our modern computers. It was actually one of the employees of the Census Bureau who came up with a punch card tabulating machine that did it.
And it was supposed to be the most detailed record ever produced in American history. This was the famous Hollerith system, and it allowed the government to categorize people with an insane level of precision that we had never seen before. According to what Edith Thorne whispered to the doctor in 1954, this census was the first time they officially tracked those unclassified citizens she called the high people. She claimed they had their own columns and their own special designations because, back then, everybody knew they were living among us. But then, on a cold morning in 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C., where these specific records were kept. Most historians will tell you it was just a freak accident caused by a pile of scrap paper, but the timing is incredibly suspicious when you look at the bigger picture. If you look at the actual news reports from that day, the fire did not even destroy everything immediately. In fact, many of the records were salvaged and stored away in vaults. But then we get to the year 1933, which is where things get truly bizarre. While the rest of the country was struggling through the Great Depression, Congress authorized the total destruction of the remaining 1890 census records. It makes you stop and think, doesn't it? Why on earth would a government authorize the destruction of perfectly salvageable records during a national crisis when they needed that data more than ever? What exactly were they so afraid we would find in those charred remains? It is not just about the paperwork either, because the physical evidence was popping up everywhere during that time. In 1909, just a few years before the Great Rehousing that Edith mentioned, the Arizona Gazette published a shocking front-page story about an explorer named G.E. Kincaid. He supposedly found a massive underground citadel in the Grand Canyon that was built to house thousands of people, and the physical remains found there were clearly not meant for someone of average height. When Edith talked about the giants being moved or hidden away, she was not just making it up to pass the time. She was describing a massive logistical operation to shift these people out of the public eye and into these asylums or underground facilities that were built to handle their size. This is where the receipts start to get real, because we have the newspaper articles, we have the congressional orders to burn the files, and we have the testimony of a woman who was actually there to see the transition happen. It makes you look at your own family history a little differently, doesn't it? Do you guys ever wonder why your family tree hits a brick wall in the late 1800s? Most people blame bad record keeping, but what if the records were actually too good? Have you ever noticed a massive gap in your genealogy where a certain relative just seems to vanish right around the turn of the century? If the paper trail was burned and the records were scrubbed, what happened to the massive cities and homes these giants lived in? If they were as common as Edith says, there has to be physical evidence left behind in the very bricks and mortar of our oldest cities, and you might be walking past it every single day without even realizing it. Architecture for the high people. You have probably seen them yourself during a weekend trip to a historic downtown area or while walking past a massive 19th century post office that looks like it belongs in ancient Rome instead of modern Ohio. You have seen the massive, heavy doors of 19th century government buildings and the 15-foot ceilings of old asylums, and while we are told it was all for ventilation, Edith Thorne had a much darker explanation. According to her, these structures were not built to impress us, but rather they were repurposed remains of a world that was actually built for the high people. She claimed that during the Great Rehousing between 1900 and 1915, these giants were systematically moved out of our neighborhoods and into specialized facilities like the Columbus State Hospital. The architecture of these places is a total beast when you really look at the scale of things. We are talking about the Kirkbride Plan buildings, which were these massive, sprawling asylums designed with grand hallways and ceilings so high you could practically fit a two-story house inside them. Mainstream history says these were built that way to allow for better air circulation to cure the patients, but Edith insisted they were actually warehouses for a population that was too big for the new, smaller world. Just think about the sheer amount of extra labor and materials it takes to build a door that is 12 feet high when a 6-foot door works just fine for everyone we know. Does it really make sense to spend that kind of money just for a little extra breeze? If you look at the physical evidence left in these old-world structures, the ergonomic layout is just completely off for a normal human being. There are records of original hardware in these buildings where the doorknobs were set nearly 5 feet off the ground, which is basically eye level for most of us today. For someone standing 9 feet tall, however, that doorknob is exactly where it needs to be at waist height. The same goes for the massive steps you see at the 1893 World's Fair, also known as the White City. They built this entire neoclassical paradise with massive lagoons and palaces in less than 2 years and then burned it all down immediately after. Why would you go through that much effort to build a city for giants, only to destroy the evidence before the next generation could see it? Go look at your own front door right now and really picture it being twice as high as it is. Does that feel like a simple decoration to you, or does it feel like a functional necessity for someone much larger who is living right next door? It makes you wonder if we are living in a world that was essentially inherited and then renovated to fit a smaller species. Edith Thorne claimed she watched as the massive furniture was hauled out and the high ceilings were dropped down with false panels to hide the original scale of our cities. She watched the world shrink in real time while the high people were ushered into the dark wings of the asylums where the public would never see them again. But Edith mentioned a very specific date of 1953, and we have to wonder why the giants finally disappeared from the wards just as a new global standard was being set. It was as if the world was being tuned to a specific frequency that they simply could not survive in anymore. Have you ever felt like you were walking through a museum instead of a city, noticing that everything from the windows to the arches feels just a bit too grand for the people inside? The 1953 Frequency Reset. In 1953, the world didn't just change its politics, it changed its very vibration. And according to the Thorne journals, this was the final nail in the coffin for the high people. You might think that a simple change in musical tuning or industrial standards wouldn't matter much to the average person, but Edith Thorne described this year as a total biological shutdown. She told Dr. Thorp that the giants were not just physically hidden away, but they were energetically locked out of our reality. This is where we get into some really fascinating science that sounds like science fiction, yet it is backed by the International Organization for Standardization. On October 14, 1953, the world officially adopted the ISO 440 Hz standard as the universal pitch for all music and broadcasting. Before this, instruments were often tuned to 432 Hz, which many researchers believe is the mathematical heartbeat of nature itself. It is the frequency of the Earth's natural resonance, and some biological theorists suggest that a 432 Hz environment actually encourages larger, more robust physical growth. When the world was retuned to 440 Hz, it wasn't just about making sure every orchestra sounded the same. It was about creating a new global background frequency that was subtly out of sync with the natural world. Edith Thorne had a chilling way of explaining this to the doctor. She said that the giants were already struggling because the atmosphere felt thinner and the weight of the world had changed. But when the new radio towers and standardized broadcasts went live in the early 50s, they simply could not breathe the new air anymore. She didn't mean they were literally suffocating for lack of oxygen, but rather that their nervous systems couldn't handle the constant, jarring vibration of the 440 Hz world. It is a bit like trying to sleep while a high-pitched alarm is constantly ringing in the distance. Eventually, your body just gives up. Yes, this frequency shift is an absolute game-changer when you realize that human biology is essentially a series of electrical impulses. If you change the frequency of the environment, you change the biology of the inhabitants. Have you ever felt a strange, underlying anxiety while walking through a crowded city, almost like your body is literally out of tune with the world around you? That might not just be stress from work, but it could be your body reacting to a frequency that was never meant for human health. Interestingly enough, medical records from 1954 show a massive spike in research papers regarding pituitary gigantism and endocrine disorders. While the mainstream story is that we were just getting better at diagnosing these issues, Edith's testimony suggests something much more calculated. She believed that the giants who were still alive in the asylums were being relabeled as medical anomalies to explain away their height. By calling it a disease, the authorities could treat these people like patients instead of like a separate race of humans. It was the perfect cover-up because it turned a historical reality into a clinical tragedy. By the time Edith was speaking to Dr. Thorp in 1954, she was one of the few people left who remembered what it was like to live in a world that felt right. She told him that once the new vibration took hold, the high people who were left in the wards simply stopped eating and faded away. They were relics of an older, grander Earth that was being systematically dismantled to make room for a smaller, more manageable population. If the frequency shift was the biological ceiling that ended the era of giants, what happened to the physical bodies that were already found across the Ohio Valley? If these people were as common as the old records suggest, there should be mountains of physical evidence. And it turns out that evidence was being found almost every time someone dug a hole for a new building in the early 20th century. The Smithsonian's missing ledgers. When you really start digging into Edith's story, you eventually hit the same brick wall that every researcher in this space encounters, and that is the physical evidence. Dr. Thorp allegedly asked Edith where the bones were, and she just laughed before telling him to ask the men in the silk hats because she was talking about the Smithsonian. Back in Edith's younger years, the men in silk hats were the elite scholars and government agents who arrived in small towns every time a farmer's plow hit something it wasn't supposed to. And the thing is, we actually have the receipts to back this up because the newspaper archives from the late 1800s are absolutely filled with these accounts. For example, on May the 5th, 1885, the New York Times published a staggering report about giant skeletons found in a burial mound in Ohio. These were not just slightly tall individuals, but the report described skeletons of gigantic proportions that were well over 8 feet tall.
Large human skulls and skeletons that measured between 7 and 8 feet in height, which, for ancient man, would have been rather significant.
One of the most chilling details mentioned in these old reports, which matches Edith's descriptions perfectly, was the presence of a double row of teeth in both the upper and lower jaws. This is a specific biological anomaly that shows up repeatedly in accounts from the Ohio Valley, specifically near places like Homer and Zanesville. Edith told the doctor that when she was a girl, seeing these remains was not even that unusual because the mounds were everywhere. But she noticed a pattern where, as soon as a discovery was made, representatives from the Smithsonian Institution would arrive to collect the remains for study. According to the official ledgers from that era, hundreds of these skeletons were shipped off to Washington, D.C. for cataloging. But if you try to find them today, you will be met with a wall of silence. The museum's own annual reports from the early 1900s contain dozens of entries for human remains over 7 feet. Yet these items have almost all been marked as missing or location unknown. It makes you stop and really think about the logic of it all. How do you lose a skeleton that is 9 feet tall? If it happened once, you could call it a mistake or a clerical error, but if it happened over 200 times, then you have to start wondering if it is actually a deliberate policy. Edith Thorne insisted that the men in silk hats weren't just studying the bones, but they were actually making sure that the physical proof of a different human timeline never made it into the public history books. Think about the sheer scale of that operation for a moment. They weren't just hiding bones, but they were hiding a reality that would change everything we know about where we come from. Do you guys believe that a prestigious institution could really lose thousands of years of physical history by accident? Or does it feel more like they are curators of a very specific, limited narrative? It is wild to imagine that the receipts for our true history are sitting in crates in a basement somewhere, blocked off from the world. As Edith Thorne took her final breath in 1954, she left Dr. Thorp with one final terrifying thought about us. She didn't just want him to know where the giants went, but she wanted him to understand what their disappearance meant for the people left behind. The atmospheric reset. What if I told you the giants didn't die out, but what if I told you they just became us? That might sound like a wild stretch at first, but Edith Thorne's final words to the doctor were not about a war or a massive plague, and they were actually about a slow and silent change in the very air we breathe. From the 1902 Smithsonian reports, we can see that the ancients lived in a world that seemed designed for massive biological success, and researchers suggest that ancient Earth actually had much higher atmospheric pressure and oxygen levels than we do today. When that pressure dropped, and the frequency reset in the 50s, the next generation simply did not have the atmospheric fuel to reach their full natural height. Think about how a bonsai tree is really just a regular tree that has been starved of the space and nutrients it needs to grow into a forest titan. Edith's big reveal was that we are essentially the bonsai version of humanity. She claimed that the Great Reset wasn't just a political move or a change in music, but it was a biological ceiling that forced our bodies to stay small and manageable for the new world order. By the time 1954 rolled around, the medical community began treating height as a pathology or a mistake in our glands. And you can see this transition clearly in the 1954 Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, which started framing these larger humans as medical patients rather than historical survivors. Does it feel like you have a potential inside you that you just can't reach? Almost like you were built for a much bigger world than this one. Maybe that feeling isn't just in your head, but it could be your DNA remembering a time when you weren't confined to 6-foot doorways and cramped spaces. Edith wasn't the last woman to live next to giants, because she was actually the last one to remember when we were giants. We have been miniaturized by a world that needed us to be smaller so that we would be easier to house and control, and that is perhaps the most chilling part of what she told the doctor before she passed away. Edith Thorne's story reminds us that history is usually written by those who survived the reset. Was she truly crazy, or are we just sleeping through a reality that was once much grander than this one? If this mystery chilled you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. What do you guys actually think happened in 1953? What is the most too big building in your city? Tell me the location in the comments below because I might just investigate it in the next video.